Let us invite Nicolás Jodal, CEO, who will talk about disruptions. Welcome, Nicolás. Thank you, friends. Welcome. Really, it's amazing to see you with a full house. Instead of talking about GeneXus, I would like to tell you something else. Breogán said, this is the sports commentator reporting. I'm not going to report about GeneXus. I'm going to talk about things which are important for the GeneXus community. And over the years, the only thing I try to do is to leave you thinking, to give you food for thought. Maybe I'm wrong, but I want you to reflect on this. And my final speech always faced I feel someone is behind me. I heard a noise behind me. Okay, come on, Danny. It's all right. Well, as I was saying, those of you who know me, these final words always give me a problem choosing the topic. So when I still have 2-3 months, my friends ask me, do you know what you're going to talk about in the final speech? I don't know yet. And every year we chose different things. Maybe I read a book, I find something relevant, so I share the knowledge about that book. I remember once a reporter asked me a question, and that led me to a presentation. But what really motivated my presentation was that speech of 2005. On that year, I had read news that were very impressive, so I talked about that. Google was the same price as General Motors. In 2005, the market value of Google had reached General Motors' value. And the world lost balance because that was not possible. A company that produces real cars cannot have the same value as Google. Google, we didn't know what it was at the time. So I talked about that in my final speech. And I never pretended to find out whether that market value was correct or not. And only time can determine if we are right or wrong. Today, in 2015, we know what the value of Google is. Google now, regarding General Motors, is 10 times worth it. So that was not only correct at the time, it was even cheap at the time. So that was one topic in 2005. And so this year, when I saw this tweet, I said, okay, I have a topic for my final talk. It says, incredible, amazing. Google is the same as General Motors. Uber is the same as General Motors. And it says they manufacture cars for millions. So in 2005, I talked about a company, Google, that was compared to General Motors. And today, Uber talks about General Motors. And in 2025, I know what I'm going to talk about. So I will continue with the same idea I had in 2005. I'm not going to make any comments about value, whether it's cheap or not. Time will tell. But the name of my talk today is called Disruptions, Part 1, just in case. Next year I may be talking about Part 2, just in case I run out of ideas for next year. So what I want to do here is try to understand the Uber phenomenon. And in order to understand such a complex phenomenon as Uber, I want to follow an advice from my chemistry teacher, Professor Raoul Coy. He told me, the human brain does not like to have phenomena it does not understand. It feels uncomfortable. It needs to find an explanation for everything. So our brain plays tricks on us. And if you don't understand a phenomenon, we will find an example just to be at ease. But we never check to see if that application is correct. So he said, don't take that road, don't take the easy road. He told me a story, the story of astronomy. In astronomy, in the past, there were difficulties to find out how planets moved, when they appeared, where they were, and there were many theories and models, but always problems. The planet was not what it should be. They did not understand things clearly. So he said, until someone arrived. And in a short period of time for humanity, we were able to understand how planets moved, what were the rules they followed. And it all started with a gentleman called Tycho Brahe. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Tycho Brahe wrote a book. And this book, as Raúl Coy told me, I'll show you one page of that book. This is a book. The book was that. And in fact, it was not a book. These were page after page of data. It was like a table. So Tycho Brahe, instead of explaining why or how planets moved, he just wrote down every single day at the same time where each planet was located, where he saw them. So Raúl told me, if you need to understand a complex phenomenon, start with data. Don't hurry to draw conclusions. And Uber is a complex phenomenon. So my request to you is that I will tell you what Uber is, and you will start drawing your own conclusions. But please hold on to your conclusions until we get to the end, okay? It's a deal. Uber. I'll talk about Uber from my experience as a user. Uber is a very simple application. You download it in Android or iOS. It's for transportation of people. When you download it, they ask for your name and a credit card number. That's it. Then you get a map. A map. It's a telephone. The telephone knows where you are. If I want to go from this place to another place in Montevideo, I press a button and I tell them where I want to go. In my experience, in a second, somebody tells me the driver with his name, with his picture, whose reputation is between 1 and 5 stars. This is the car plate. Will take so many minutes to get to where you are. When a minute is about to expire, it says, come down, the car is approaching. So I get on the car, I tell, hi, Jose, I know your name already. And he says, hi, Nicolás. So I don't have to tell him where I'm going. The application already knows. So I travel, I get to my destination. He says, we arrived. Thank you, Jose. I leave. I don't pay. I do nothing. 2 minutes later, I get a notification saying your trip is this cost, so many dollars. It's cheaper than a taxi, and it's so much money. And I have to score the driver between 1 and 5 stars. I score him and enter, and that's Uber. This is what I'm going to talk about today. Now, let me tell you a few details behind Uber which make the difference. The first is, almost all drivers in Uber are not professionals. They are not Uber. One of the interesting things is that people talk as Uber as a verb. I am Uber. I am Ubering, or that means I'm working for Uber. And I remember one of the first drivers I met, I said, what do you do for a living? He said, do you know airplanes? When they arrive, someone's there with a flag, that's me. Oh, good, I said. And he said, what do you do with Uber? He said, well, I was young, I want to go out at night, so I know that Uber pays me, and I'm paid every Thursday. For every $8, you get 80% and 20% Uber retains. So I work Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, Thursday I get my money, and Thursday night I go out. Friday morning I have no money at all. That was one driver. The other driver told me, well, I'm an interior decorator. When I finish working, instead of going back home and watch television and get fat, I work for Uber. I meet people and I get this extra cash for my holidays. So these people are people who have a car. They own the car, and when they are free, they put the car at the disposal of passengers who want to go somewhere. That's the first point. Second interesting point, the prices are dynamic. I mean, you can say, well, a taxi is dynamic. The farther you go, the more you pay. But in addition to that, the price depends on supply and demand at the time. It's not a fixed price. So how does it happen? Imagine that we are here, we go out, it starts raining and everybody wants Uber. So on the map, we'll see lots of people on this side asking for Uber. So automatically, as there's a very high demand, the price goes up. Now the drivers, as I have an application as a passenger, they have an application as drivers, and they check the hot spots, the areas where prices are higher. So automatically they tend to move to higher price zones, and the more they move, the price comes down. And this is the tragedy of the commons, as the economists call it. And see how interesting, the application itself regulates supply and demand. So for economists, it's like looking at an incentive program working on real time, regulating where you go to and how you move. And the third fact, which is very important, is the user experience, which is tremendous. You don't feel that you're taking a taxi. For example, if you start talking to the driver, that's very pleasant. And you may say, how do you know it's pleasant? Well, this conversation is pleasant. Why? Because of a detail. Because at the end, when the trip is over, I have to score the person, but he will also score me. So when we travel together, we might never meet again, but I know I depend on him and he depends on me. So automatically we'll have a good relationship. If the drivers feel it that way, if he is under 4 stars, the system will expel him and he will never find passengers willing to drive with him, unless the passenger also has few stars. But the mechanism, the user experience, you feel that you're not taking a taxi. You feel as if you were having your own personal driver. That's Uber. This is what I had to share with you. This is Uber. Let's see how they did. I'm sure that you're thinking about, well, this will never work in Uruguay. But before you start thinking that, I'll give you the good news and the bad news from the viewpoint of Uber. Look at the bad news first. And they're quite bad. It was declared illegal in many countries, in many cities. Like in Spain, it's illegal throughout. In Berlin, it is illegal. In a county in Florida, it's illegal. They told me in Sao Paulo, it's illegal. It's illegal in many places, and this is interesting because when there is a disruption of this sort, we always find regulatory obstacles. By illegal, I mean they're not doing something wrong. They're doing something that is not regulated. If technologies are advanced enough, they go beyond regulations. I have received many ideas, and most of the times I wonder if they are legal or not. When I send them to a lawyer, the lawyer never says no. He says, well, never thought about it before. So technology many times is far ahead of regulations. So it was illegal. They have many lawsuits. They have a famous one in California where there is a discussion as to whether the drivers are employees or not. There was violence also in France and in Mexico. So taxi drivers were violent against Uber drivers. So these are the bad news. Let's look at the good news. The good news. Well, there's presence in 58 countries and 300 cities. This will easily cover 100 countries and a lot more cities. Second, the activities. They have over 1 million drivers and they do over 1 million trips a day. You could say it's 1-to-1. One driver, one trip a day. That's not correct, because remember the story I told you. The drivers are not full-time. They work a few hours and that's all. So the activity of Uber is growing permanently. Then, in many cities worldwide, they are regulated. For example, Mexico. Mexico DF, they reached an agreement with the municipal government, and Uber pays DF 1.5% of each trip, and Uber can therefore be regulated. Well, they were happy, so you don't need to laugh. That's how things work. I told you I was going to give you data. I was not going to interpret data. And the other interesting thing is, who are some of the investors in Uber? Look at them. Google, in 2013, invested $250 million for 6% of the company. In 2014, Baidu, which is the search of China, invested a very high figure, and Microsoft this year sold the maps and links and devoted a whole department for Uber, because for Uber maps are very important, and they invested something that was not made public, but $1 billion. So that's Uber. And I'm sure that you're wondering, now what's the relation between Uber and asking for taxi, because there are many apps, like Easy Taxi in several countries of the world, 99 taxis in Brazil, Voyant Taxi, important in Uruguay. What's the difference between Uber and these three companies? I would say that the difference is very subtle, but very relevant. What these applications do is improve the experience of asking for a taxi, but Uber improves the experience of the whole transportation. You have a mechanism with dynamic prices, so Uber is able to regulate demand and direct the drivers. If I tell you that the reputation scheme makes poor drivers to be expelled from the system, that's also important. So the mechanism of this user experience is far higher in Uber than in the other paid taxi applications, which are good and better than the mechanisms we had before. But for you to see the importance of the user experience, there's another competitor called Lyft. Lyft is the same as Uber, the same story, all the same that I told you, but they differentiate according to user experience. And Uber is like having a personal driver, and Lyft is like having a friend who drives you. You may tell me what's the difference, but if you have a driver, where do you sit? At the back. If you have a friend, where do you sit? In front. So with Uber, you sit at the back. With Lyft, you sit at the front. That's the difference. It's subtle, but important. Because what is regulated is the competition. The competition lies in user experience. Now, in the end, what Uber or Lyft do, what they do is making a resource available. The resource is the car, the owner of the car. So when that resource is free, it's shared with others. That was made by Uber with a car, but you can do it with any other resource. So there is another company, Airbnb, which does exactly the same with a very similar model, but instead of doing it with cars, they do it with rooms in a house. If I have a spare room in my house and I want to rent it, I follow the same mechanism as Uber. I publish this at Airbnb. I will have a reputation. Someone will come with a reputation, variable prices, and so on. Airbnb is doing the same in the world of accommodation. It has less conflict than Uber, maybe because Airbnb is less regulated, or because the Uber culture is more aggressive. Airbnb, of course, is in Uruguay. The other day, I know there are about 2,500 houses or flats or rooms available in Uruguay. And last year, or this summer, Airbnb said they have 17 million reserves already confirmed. And this has grown and expanded tremendously. As we have Airbnb for houses, Uber and Lyft for cars, we've had what is called the sharing economy. So all these companies are grouped together in a category that is called the sharing economy. And if you look at a world map, these are some of the examples. I brought this one because I was very surprised that there's nothing in Latin America. So I hope that this presentation will serve you to trigger something here in Latin America, a startup or a disruptor in the sharing economy. So these are the data I wanted to share with you. And this leads me back to my teacher, my chemistry teacher, Raúl Coe, who went on with a story. He said, after Tycho Brahe, who wrote this book with data, only data, we had another gentleman called Johannes Kepler. I was going to say Jonathan, but Jonathan is somebody else. Da Silveira's friend, I think. But, well, Kepler said, look, all the data written by Tycho Brahe can be summarized in 3 rules. Only 3 rules summarize the former. So what I want to do is, well, all these things about Uber, Lyft, Airbnb must be summarized into 2 rules. But I'll try to summarize that into 2 rules. And the one who helped me doing this is Ben Thompson. I got to Ben Thompson through Marcos Vejeres from De La Robla and Associates. I want him to join me here on stage. That was a joke. Don't panic, Marcos. Don't panic. You were standing up, right? Okay, hi, how are you? No, don't do that. So Marcos, he didn't tell me this. He put a Twitter, and I followed the Twitter. Ben Thompson has a blog called Strategery. He's one of the people who's thinking about technology strategies, and he wrote speculation. He called it theory of aggregation. So I want to explain what theory of aggregation is. It will help us understand what happens with Uber, Airbnb, and we'll try to avoid facile conclusions about this. So what is the aggregation theory? Let's imagine we have a market of consumers. Any market of consumers has a value chain that can be divided between suppliers on one hand, distributors, and consumers. This is the way it is. And what we know is very clear. There are 2 ways in which you can make money. The first one is to have a horizontal monopoly. I am the owner or the sole supplier or the sole distributor. That's a rule. You make money doing that. The other possibility, if you cannot have the monopoly, is to be the one that integrates better to one of these components. If you integrate vertically, you make more money. Now let's imagine the case before the internet age. If we had no internet, on the one hand we have more consumers than suppliers. And to contact with each of them costs money. It's hard for us to contact them. So if each contact costs money, my business is to go to a smaller amount of people. So all distributors before the internet were successful because they were integrated backwards from the distributor to the supplier. What does that mean? It means that in order to be successful, you go to a distributor and you need to relate strategically with the suppliers. Those who have the best suppliers have good, cheap products, and the consumers will appear. So the user experience is second level rated. And they need to connect to suppliers. When a distributor goes to a foreign country and meets suppliers, he will never want to go with another distributor. He will never tell who he's going to visit. That's a secret. The relationships are strategic. That is traditional. To integrate, the distributor will integrate to the supplier. Now, what happens after the internet? When internet arrives, this is a transactional cost, according to economists. The cost of communicating is zero or is close to zero. So this opens up a new opportunity for a new player, for a new distributor. What does he do? Instead of integrating to suppliers, he will integrate to consumers or users. That is why we have the theory of aggregation. These are distributors that add consumers. What they have is consumers. If I can have lots of consumers, then suppliers will appear. The other way around, the opposite of the other theory. If I had a good, cheap products, consumers will appear. But here we have a different paradigm. If I have lots of consumers, suppliers will appear. So this causes disruptions in the market. This leads to a new player that plays with by different rules. In the former, relations with suppliers was strategic. In this new world, the user experience is strategic. It plays the other way around. Now, what happens when in a market we have this type of disruption? When a new player comes and plays by new rules. Here we have the second rule by Clay Christensen, who said, this is the law of conservation of attractive profits. It's a little bit sumptuous, but if you have a player that changes the rules of the game, those incumbent, those who dominated the market before, will see that the profits drop. But the dropping profits do not disappear. Somebody keeps them. That is why profit is attractive, and it's in an adjacent place. A typical case would be the manufacture of computers. When manufacturing a computer was difficult, the manufacturers made a lot of money. With the PCs, to manufacture a PC was just assembling components and adding an OS. So those who produced hardware increased profits. But where did the profits go? To the manufacturer of OS and modules to assemble the computers. So that is the law of conservation of attractive profits. When there's a new player in the field, profits move elsewhere. See how this works in the case of Airbnb. I'll show you how through these rules we can see a very different view. Let's imagine that we have hotels. Before internet, hotels wanted guests. What did they do? They integrated property and trust. One of the problems in a hotel, if I'm going to sleep, I have to trust them that this is a trustworthy place. So they built something with all empty rooms together, and at the door they had a seal that said this is a well-known chain, so you trusted the chain, you went there. That was integrated. They outsourced the reservation mechanism only. Now, what happens if Airbnb appears? What was the game? They reorganize the puzzle in quite a different way. What they do is the following. Again, we have guests, and they put together the trust becomes digital. Trust was not digital, but now it is. How do they transform this? By a double reputation mechanism that I talked about. They bring together, they integrate the game in a different way. Trust, that is digital, with reservation. With that, they are able to commoditize the property. It's not necessary to build something to put empty rooms in it. Any flat, any room in my home is useful. Why? Because the trust mechanism and reservation mechanism is elsewhere, which means this is commoditizing the incumbent. In other words, a strategic job belonging to the incumbent became a commodity, and now anyone can have a room available for guests. it can be separated from the rest. This is to commoditize the incumbent. This is what Airbnb is doing, and I will show how Uber works it. Let's look at Uber. Before the internet,
the passengers have the cars that were integrated with the dispatch system. And what was outsourced was the mechanism for hailing the cabs and paying. What did Uber do? They changed the components somewhat. What they did was integrate the dispatch system to the system for hailings and payment, and with this they managed that the cars are commoditized. Any car becomes a commodity. It's not that the cars are digital now, the cars are still physical. What they turned into software was the trust system. And this is the big change. This is why the incumbents very quickly lose their profits and end up in these new companies. This is what we call the sharing economy. But with the theory of aggregation, the case is the same as the e-commerce. What did a market maker like Mercado Libre do? They united trust with the matchmaking mechanisms and the users, so anyone can be a supplier. The suppliers used to be strategic and almost secret sometimes, but now with a matchmaker like Mercado Libre, anyone can become a supplier. So this is happening not only in the sharing economy, but in all those other places like the search, the social network, etc. And now we can explain much better this process. You probably saw it recently in Twitter. Someone said something strange is happening because Uber is the biggest taxi company and it has no taxes. Facebook is the biggest content company and doesn't pay anyone for the content. Alibaba is a retailer that doesn't have stocks. And Airbnb said the same thing with regard to the rooms. So something strange is happening, and now we know exactly what it is. What's happening is that each one of these markets commoditized the incumbent. They turned a task which belonged to the incumbent, which was strategic, into something that is irrelevant, and that's what's happening. And this brings me back to Raúl Scoe's story. He said in astronomy something much more interesting is happening. Tycho Brahe wrote the databases and Kepler wrote the rules. But then Isaac Newton said the three Kepler rules are a particular law of a law that he called law of universal gravitation, which explains not only what happens with planets, but also it explains that when I have an apple and let it go, it's going to fall. So this theory is much more general, and I want to introduce then the Isaac Newton of my story of today. He's called Mark Andreessen, and I know what you're thinking. He has a cone head. It seems that people tease him about the shape of his head, but for those of you who don't know him, he's a mythical character of Silicon Valley, one of the founders of Netscape and one of the most successful venture capitals of the moment. He sold WhatsApp to Facebook, etc. He's very provoking, and in 2011 he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal for concerning the rule that explains all that is happening, something similar to Newton's law. Why is the software eating the world? All that I'm telling you is happening because the software is eating the world. Since he is someone who likes provoking people, he then wrote an article that said that companies have to be responsive. They have to respond to what's going on in the best possible way. And that way is to be software companies. But he says that we are all talking about the same thing and we are creating work for ourselves. So This year, Francisco González, who is CEO of the BBVA, a bank, said that this year the world has to be invaded or will be invaded by software. So we see lots of articles in the press, and we see changes in transportation, in commerce, in the hotel business, etc. The good thing when you have a good theory is that you can go from the theory to the facts, and you can work it backwards, and the facts that were difficult to understand will be more easily understood. So these facts I told you about, we are going to analyze them backwards. What happens is that the software is eating the world. So we have disruptions in many industries. The interesting thing is that the same thing keeps repeating itself. No matter what the industry is, what's happening is exactly the same thing. There's someone who has found a way of making something digital and therefore of commoditizing the incumbent. That is the basis of all the disruptions. And once this happens, then profits will move to those who are solving the most attractive component of the time or the most difficult problem. When the computers were started to be made by anyone, then the profits went to those who made software. And that's the heart of the matter of what's happening at the moment. Why do I tell you all this? Why is it relevant for the GeneXus community? Because I think that from now on, more and more, we are going to be involved in what you see here. Big battles between David and Goliath, between the incumbent and the disruptor. Sometimes we are going to be on the side of the incumbent, sometimes we're going to be on the side of the disruptor. What I do know is that this battle is going to be fought with just one weapon, software. There are many incumbents that think that the battle is going to be fought on the side of regulations. And they say Uber is successful because it's not regulated. When it is regulated, it will no longer be successful. But I don't think that that's the case. It's good that they pay taxes. I pay taxes, so I want everyone else to pay. And I don't think that regulations is the mechanism for fighting the battle. The battle with which battles are going to be fought, these battles between incumbents and disruptors is software. And we make software, so let's see what we have to learn or what we have to master as software manufacturers. Firstly, you've seen that in this event the user experience came up again and again in presentations. So try to read as much as you can or hear as much as you can about user experience. We have to gain users and consumers, and this we will through the user's experience. Another important thing is mobile, that's very important, and then rapid application development. We have to manufacture systems that we discover as we make them. We see what's working and what is not. And finally, we have to solve the most difficult problem. So this is basically what I had to tell you today. And if you ask me to summarize it further, I will tell you, my friends, we're going to go through a time in which we're going to take part in these battles of great disruption. Sometimes we'll be on the side of the incumbent, other times on the side of the disruptor. But that's one thing we have to do all at the same time. We have to try to solve with software the most relevant problems of the moment. Thank you very much. And I dedicate this presentation to my Professor Raúl Cohen. Thank you.